Earth Systems 3209. Unit 2, Historical Geology. References can be found in the text in Chapter 6, Chapter 8, Appendix A, and Appendix B. Unit 2, Topic 4.2. Life Forms and Geologic Time. The focus of this lesson is recognizing that the Phanerozoic Eon represents the emergence of the first visible life in rocks. Also, we will focus on listing the different life forms and correlating their presence to corresponding geologic times. When we look at fossils, fossils indicate evolutionary pathways. That is, the prehistoric life that is found in the remnants of rocks dating back to over 500 million years. We can see how life changed throughout geologic time. In the earliest time, marked by the Precambrian Eon, there was little direct evidence of fossils due to the lack of hard body parts. Thus, 87% of geologic time contained very little fossil evidence. As the Precambrian came to a close, the fossil record showed multicellular organisms, which made it possible for the evolution and more complex plants and animals in the Paleozoic Era. This fossil evidence that is found in the Precambrian period are represented by algae, bacteria, and other traces of soft-bodied organisms. So in conclusion, in the Precambrian period, there is very little direct evidence of life. What you can see is some evidence of soft-bodied organisms and also traces of once living organisms that existed during this time. The Paleozoic Era is an era that ranges from 540 million years to approximately 245 million years ago. The beginning of the Paleozoic Era is marked by the first appearance of life forms, which had hard body parts. Abundant fossils in the Paleozoic allowed scientists to construct a detailed timescale for the last 13% of geologic time. Paleozoic time can be divided as follows. We have the early Paleozoic, which is made up of the Cambrian and Ordovician periods. Middle Paleozoic time, which is made up of the Silurian and Devonian periods. And late Paleozoic time, made up of the Carboniferous and the Permian periods. When we look at the Paleozoic time in more detail, the early Paleozoic Era, which is made up of the Cambrian and Ordovician periods, we see life during this time was restricted to seas. They consist of several invertebrate groups. Invertebrates eventually evolved into vertebrates. And in the Cambrian period, we can see the trilobite evolving. Trilobite life was restricted to the oceans. In the Ordovician, a broad range of invertebrates started to evolve, namely brachiopods, and later we see the very first fish, which marked the very first vertebrate life form evolving at the end of the Ordovician. Because of most of the life forms are invertebrates at this time, the early Paleozoic Era is known as the Age of the Invertebrate. When we look at the Middle Paleozoic Era, the Middle Paleozoic Era is made up of the Silurian and Devonian periods. Life in the water started to move to the land, and this is where we see our first land plants. Fish evolved to see the very first bony fish, and sharks evolved during this time. And in the evolution, we see that the lungfish and lobe-finned fish adapted to life environments on land. It is believed that these organisms were the two that were responsible for evolving into amphibians by the end of the Devonian period. This middle life that's found in the Paleozoic Era is known as the age of the fishes, and we see an abundance of fish in the Devonian. At the end of the Paleozoic Era, this is represented by the Carboniferous period and the Permian periods. During this time, plant life at the water's edge moved inland and formed forests by the end of the Devonian. Life forms were abundant on land. These life forms were known as the amphibians. And the amphibians evolved into reptiles in the Permian, and reptiles are known as the first true land dwellers that actually lived on land and reproduced without going back to the water. This is one advancement of the reptiles over amphibians. Reptiles developed a hard-shelled egg, which enabled it to reproduce and live on land, whereas the amphibians had soft-shelled eggs and needed an aquatic environment in order to reproduce. Continuing into the late Paleozoic Era, the hard-shelled eggs made it possible for the reptiles to live on land. But because the amphibian was the most dominant life form during this time, the late Paleozoic is known as the age of the amphibians. At the end of the Paleozoic Era was marked by a mass extinction, where approximately 95% of all life forms on Earth became extinct. One possible explanation involved the formation of a supercontinent, Pangaea. The extinction of the trilobite, amongst other invertebrates, are the most common organisms that became extinct at this time. Moving into the Mesozoic Era, which is known as the age of the reptile, this time existed approximately from 245 million years ago to approximately 66 million years ago. During the Mesozoic time, we see the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous as the three periods that make up the Mesozoic Era. During Mesozoic time, reptiles have shell-covered eggs that could be laid on land. This eliminated the water stage of reproduction, as seen with amphibians. It was perhaps the most advanced that made reptiles be able to live on land permanently. This one evolution breakthrough enabled reptiles to dominate Earth for the next 160 million years, until the end of the Mesozoic, approximately 66 million years ago. We also see the first flowering plants evolve at the end of the Jurassic period. One form of reptile marked a remarkable step in evolution. It was the first to take to the sky and fly. Jurassic time marked the first evidence of birds in the fossil record. On land, the dinosaur became the dominant species, and hence this area is called the age of the reptiles, and some call it the age of the dinosaur. We also see in the Mesozoic Era the very first mammal appearing in the fossil record, and again at the end of the Mesozoic Era we see a mass extinction where reptiles, including dinosaurs and numerous other species, became extinct. In the Cenozoic Era, the age of the mammals, which occupied the Earth from approximately 66 million years ago to present time. The Cenozoic Era is made up of two periods, called the Tertiary and the Quaternary periods. Mammals replaced reptiles as the dominant animals on Earth. Flowering plants are the dominant plant species on land. Some mammals became extinct during the late Cenozoic, which was approximately 11 100,000 years ago. These include the mastodon, the mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, large ground sloth, giant bison, amongst other mammals. Because mammals were so abundant during this time, the Cenozoic Era is known as the Age of the Mammals. If we look at this chart, or this diagram here to the right, we notice that we have the breakdown of geologic time in millions of years on the left side. We also find across the top the main life forms that existed and the range at which the life forms existed throughout geologic time, stretching from the invertebrates back in the Paleozoic to the mammals in the Cenozoic. During geologic time, we see the emergence of the first invertebrates late in the Precambrian time, a little over 570 million years ago. These organisms dominated and evolved and became widespread in the oceans for the next 60 million years. At approximately 505 million years ago, we see the very first emergence of fish. At approximately 360 million years ago, we see the emergence of amphibians, followed by about 280 million years ago, the emergence of reptiles. Then we see the emergence of mammals and birds in the Jurassic period, approximately 150 million years ago. These organisms still exist on Earth today. If we want to rank the emergence of life forms throughout geologic time, we can see, according to the chart to the right, that single-celled organisms were the first to evolve. That would be in the Paleozoic, followed by invertebrates, followed by fish, followed by the first land plants, then amphibians, followed by reptiles in the Mesozoic Era, birds, flowering plants, and mammals. Sometimes to help memorize the order in which these organisms had evolved, we can do a little mnemonic device. Take the first letter of each of the life forms and write it down. For example, single-celled organisms. Write down S, invertebrates, fish, first land plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, flowering plants, and mammals. For each of these letters, you could come up with a word that makes a sentence that you can memorize, and then from each of the words, you know which is the first letter in the division of the life form that existed. So you can make up your own mnemonic device to help memorize the evolution of different life forms as we go from Paleozoic time right up to modern time, where we see the mammals dominate. Let's have a look at some examples. First example reads, which describes the progression of life forms from Precambrian to Cenozoic. So if you look at the mnemonic device that you could make up, outlining the evolution of life through time, we see that fish, followed by amphibians, followed by reptiles, followed by mammals, would be the best answer for question 1. Also, when you look at the answers here, notice that amphibians would be the first choice, but reptiles, in this case, would be your last choice. And we know that amphibians were directly followed by the reptiles. So we know that these order of progression of life for choices A and B could not possibly be the correct answers. But when we look at question C and answer C and answer D, we see that mammals represent the last life forms. And if we look at the geologic time scale, mammals were dominant in the Cenozoic Era, which represents last life forms. Now we just need to know which life form preceded the others. Again, we have fish as our first two choices, and in the evolution of life, we just need to know that amphibians, which was present in the late Paleozoic Era, eventually evolved into the first reptiles, which moved and lived on land full time. And then we would know our best choice for question number 1 is C. Fish evolved into amphibians, which evolved into reptiles, and lastly evolved into mammals, which dominate the Mesozoic Era. Let's look at question number 2. It says, in what geologic era would one find a rock layer containing numerous dinosaur fossils? So if we look at the different life forms throughout geologic time, we know that during the Cenozoic Era, this is known as the age of the mammal. So mammals dominated life on Earth during Cenozoic time. In Paleozoic time, life was restricted to the oceans, and life started to move to land. So it wasn't dominant life forms on land at this time. The Phanerozoic is an eon, so it wouldn't represent the geologic era. And our choice and best answer in this case will be the Mesozoic. And the Mesozoic is known as the age of the reptile, where dinosaurs were the main life forms during the Mesozoic era. So again, if we look at question 1, our answer for question 1 is C. And for question 2, dinosaurs were the dominant life forms in the Mesozoic era. Let's look at another couple questions for example 2. First question reads, what life form was last to evolve? So if we go back and look at the evolution of life forms again, your fish were the organisms which evolved from invertebrates, followed by amphibians in the middle Paleozoic, followed by reptiles in the Mesozoic, and then followed by mammals in the Cenozoic. So the answer to the last life form to evolve would be your mammals, which is represented in the Cenozoic era. The next question reads, in which era did the organism below exist? So if we look at the organism located to the right of the answers, this is a trilobite. And a trilobite is an invertebrate which lived throughout the Paleozoic era. And it is one of the main life forms that dominated life in the early Paleozoic, but it also existed through the middle and late ages of the Paleozoic era, where it became extinct at the Mesozoic-Paleozoic boundary. So the answer for this question would be Paleozoic. Trilobites dominated during the Paleozoic era. One important note to consider here is questions on the public exam usually take the form of multiple choice when dealing with the geologic time scale. Your turn. Take the time to complete the following questions. You can stop the recording now, prepare your answers, and the solutions to the questions will be on the following slides. Let's look at the questions. First question reads, which geologic time span is referred to as the age of the reptile? Our choices would be Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and Proterozoic. From previous studies in the slides, we see that the Proterozoic is one of the eons that's located in Precambrian time, therefore don't meet the qualifications of having hard-shelled or hard-bodied life forms. Therefore, it would not be the best answer in this case. Cenozoic is known as the age of the mammal, and in the Paleozoic, we have the early Paleozoic, which where invertebrates dominated, the middle Paleozoic, amphibians dominated, or fishes dominated, sorry, and in the late Paleozoic, we have the amphibians dominated. So the age of the reptiles would be restricted to the Mesozoic era. That's when reptiles dominated the Earth. If we look at the last question, it says rocks from which era would contain fossils of trilobites? So again, if we look at the different eras, the Cenozoic mainly had mammals dominating. Mesozoic had reptiles dominating. The Phanerozoic is an eon, so it don't fall into the classification of which era. Therefore, your Paleozoic would be your best answer. So, the era which contained fossils of trilobites would be C, the Paleozoic. So the solutions outlined here for question 1. The Mesozoic will be known as the age of the reptile, and fossils were found in the Paleozoic era. In summary, let's look at the overview of the geologic timescale. Let's start from the most recent time and work our way back to the oldest. The most recent era is known as the Cenozoic Era, and the Cenozoic Era can be divided into two periods, the Tertiary and the Quaternary. During the Cenozoic time, mammals were the most dominant species on Earth. Therefore, the Cenozoic is known as the age of the mammal. And some dominant life forms that existed in the Tertiary, we see many different mammals, such as a variety, including the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed cat, to mention two. And some of the most recent developments of life forms will be humans during the Quaternary period. When we move back to the Mesozoic Era, the Mesozoic Era is made up of three periods: the Triassic, followed by the Jurassic, and followed by Cretaceous. During these periods of time, reptiles were the most dominant species on Earth. Therefore, the Mesozoic Era is known as the age of the reptiles, and the most dominant species during this time would be your dinosaurs. When we look at Mesozoic time, we see dinosaurs being introduced during the Triassic period, where they dominate from the Triassic moving into the Jurassic time. But we also see the very first emergence of birds in the Jurassic period. And in the Cretaceous period, we see our first plants developing flowering plants, which is the most diverse group of plants on Earth today. In the oldest period, representing Paleozoic time, we see the Cambrian period followed by the Ordovician period. During this time frame, invertebrates were the main organisms that dominated the seas. Therefore, the late Paleozoic was known as the age of the invertebrate. Moving up through the periods, Silurian period was followed by the Devonian period. During these two periods of time, fishes in the oceans were the main life forms. And moving up still, we have the Carboniferous period, followed by the Permian period. During the late Paleozoic, amphibians were the main dominant life forms on Earth. And they more or less moved to the land, but they had to remain close to water environments in order to reproduce because they had soft-shelled eggs. So therefore, the late Paleozoic was known as the age of the amphibian. So in the Cambrian period, we see our first shelled organisms, which is our true first fossils with hard parts. In the Ordovician period, we see trilobites dominant. In the Silurian, we see our first land plants. In the Devonian, we see fishes dominating the oceans. In the Carboniferous, we see the amphibians starting to dominate and move on to land. And in the Permian, we see our very first true land dwellers, known as the reptiles. Because they laid hard-shelled eggs, they can move on land permanently and reproduce and migrate inland.